America has a habit of moving on quickly and leaving things behind. Whole towns, whole islands, whole pieces of its own history sitting in the weeds while everyone drives past on the interstate. Some of these places are stunning. Some are haunting. All of them deserve better than the obscurity they've landed in. I bet you've never heard of these 15 forgotten places in America. Number 15. Haena Island of the American South, Cahaba, Alabama. Cahaba was once the capital of Alabama. Between 1820 and 1826, it served as the state's first permanent capital, a city that boosters predicted would become one of the great inland ports of the American South, sitting at the confluence of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers, in a location that seemed strategically ideal until the rivers made their own opinion known by flooding the place repeatedly and with increasing enthusiasm. The capital was moved to Tuscaloosa in 1826 after one flood too many, and Cahaba's decline began almost immediately. The city persisted as a regional center through the antebellum period and served as a Confederate prisoner of war camp during the Civil War. Castle Morgan, as it was called, held Union prisoners in conditions that deteriorated badly as the war progressed, with thousands confined in a space designed for far fewer. After the war, Cahaba continued to shrink. A catastrophic flood in 1865 accelerated the exodus, and by the 1870s, most residents had relocated permanently to Selma, 12 miles away, taking whatever they could carry and leaving the rest. Today, Old Cahaba is an archaeological park managed by the Alabama Historical Commission, and what remains is largely foundations, chimneys, and the ghost of a street grid visible through the vegetation. The cemetery is still there, largely maintained, holding the graves of people who believed they were building something permanent. The site sits in a floodplain, which means the river that ended Cahaba's ambitions still visits periodically, as if checking to make sure nobody has moved back in. Number 14. Haena Level Abandonment, Rhyolite, Nevada. Rhyolite is a ghost town in the Mojave Desert near Death Valley, and it had one of the faster rise and fall trajectories in Nevada mining history. Gold was discovered in the area in 1904, and within 3 years, Rhyolite had a population of between 5,000 and 10,000 people, a 3-story bank building, a train depot, a school, multiple newspapers, and a house built entirely from glass bottles, approximately 50,000 of them, by a saloon keeper named Tom Kelly, who reportedly couldn't afford more conventional building materials. By 1910, the gold was essentially played out, the mines were closing, and the population was collapsing as rapidly as it had assembled. By 1920, Rhyolite was functionally abandoned. What makes Rhyolite slightly different from the dozens of other Nevada ghost towns is what happened to it afterward. It became an art destination. A Belgian mining company that still had a small interest in the area commissioned a series of large-scale outdoor sculptures in the 1980s and 1990s. And the Goldwell Open Air Museum now sits on the edge of town, featuring works, including a life-size rendition of the figures from Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, cast in white plaster, set against the desert and the ruins of the mining town behind it. The bottle house has been partially restored and still stands. The ruins of the Cook Bank building, 3 stories of concrete that were cutting-edge construction for a desert mining camp in 1908, also remain, their empty windows framing the sky. Death Valley National Park is nearby, which brings some visitors through, though most drive on toward the park itself without realizing that the ruins of a 10,000-person city are sitting just off the highway. Number 13. Fordlândia, American Ambition in the Amazon, Ford's Michigan Echo. Henry Ford wanted rubber for his cars and didn't want to pay the British-controlled market price for it. So in 1928, he bought a tract of land roughly the size of Tennessee in the Brazilian Amazon and set about building an American industrial town from scratch in the middle of the jungle. He named it Fordlândia, and the project was ambitious to the point of delusion. Ford intended to reproduce an idealized American small town, complete with Cape Cod-style houses, a hospital, a school, a golf course, and a strict prohibition on alcohol, in a region of Brazil that had no interest in any of those things. The rubber plantation failed comprehensively. Ford's agronomists planted the rubber trees in dense monoculture rows, which allowed a South American leaf blight to sweep through and destroy the crop repeatedly. The workers, who had been recruited from across Brazil with promises of regular wages and modern amenities, revolted multiple times over working conditions, curfews, and a cafeteria that initially served American food, including oatmeal, in tropical heat to workers who had no context for or interest in it. There were riots. Equipment was damaged. Brazilian managers eventually took over day-to-day operations. Ford sold Fordlândia to the Brazilian government in 1945 for a fraction of what he had spent, having never visited the place himself. The town has been inhabited by a small Brazilian population ever since, around 2,000 people, and the American-era buildings, including the water tower, the Ford logo-stamped machinery left rusting in the jungle, and the suburban streets slowly being reclaimed by vegetation, are still there. It is not technically American territory, but it is entirely an American story, and it belongs on this list. Number 12. Colemanskop of the American West, Body Neighbor, Masonic, California. Masonic is a ghost town in Mono County, California, sitting in the eastern Sierra Nevada at an elevation of roughly 7,000 feet, named after the fraternal organization whose members founded it during a gold rush that began in 1902. At its peak, Masonic had several hundred residents, a stamp mill for processing ore, and enough commercial infrastructure to suggest it might outlast the claims that founded it. It did not. The mines petered out within a decade, and the population dispersed by around 1909 to 1910. What remains, accessible via a dirt road that requires high clearance and reasonable nerve, is a collection of wooden structures in various states of elegant collapse, including a large two-story mill building whose weathered boards and rusted machinery have been photographed extensively by visitors willing to make the drive. The cemetery, as is true of most Sierra mining town cemeteries, contains an uncomfortable number of young graves. What distinguishes Masonic from other well-documented California ghost towns is specifically that it isn't well documented, at least not by mainstream travel or history resources. It sits north of Bodie, which draws most of the ghost town tourism in that region, and Masonic has benefited from that misdirection. The structures have survived longer than they might have otherwise precisely because casual curiosity doesn't usually push far enough north on that particular dirt road to find them. Local historian and Sierra Nevada writer Genny Schumacher-Smith documented the town in her regional surveys, noting that Masonic represents the gold rush experience in miniature, ambition, extraction, and exit, all compressed into a single decade. Number 11. The Lost Colony Infrastructure, Bath, North Carolina. Bath is the oldest incorporated town in North Carolina, chartered in 1705, and it has a population today of roughly 250 people in a small cluster of buildings along the Pamlico River in Beaufort County. It is not abandoned. People live there, the post office functions, the small Episcopal church holds services, but it exists in a state of such profound historical overlay that walking through it feels like visiting a museum that forgot to put up the velvet ropes. The town served as North Carolina's colonial capital for several decades in the early 18th century, and it has authentic surviving structures from that period. St. Thomas Episcopal Church, completed in 1734, is the oldest surviving church building in North Carolina and holds services to this day. The Palmer Marsh House, built around 1744, stands essentially intact. The Bonner House, from around 1830, is a well-preserved example of federal period architecture that has never been significantly altered. The town is also associated with Blackbeard. The pirate Edward Teach lived in Bath periodically between raids and reportedly received a pardon from the colonial governor there in 1718 before returning to piracy and being killed later that same year off the North Carolina coast. His connection to Bath has been documented in colonial records and gives the town a specific kind of historical resonance that most coastal communities twice its size have never accumulated. The North Carolina Historic Sites Program manages several of the buildings, but Bath itself remains startlingly quiet, unhurried, and almost entirely off the radar of anyone not already looking for it. Number 10. Thurmond, West Virginia. Thurmond, West Virginia is a town with a current population of approximately 5 people, which makes it one of the smallest incorporated municipalities in the United States. It sits in the New River Gorge in Fayette County, accessible only by a single road and by the rail line that is, in many ways, the reason the town exists at all. At its peak in the early 20th century, Thurmond was one of the most important coal shipping points on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, handling millions of tons of coal annually and supporting a population of several hundred people. The town had everything a coal-era company town needed: hotels, a bank, a depot that processed enormous volumes of freight, and a reputation for gambling and vice in the hotels along the main street that persisted through multiple reform campaigns. The Dunglin Hotel, which no longer stands, was said to have hosted a poker game that ran continuously for 14 years without interruption, which is either an extraordinary testament to human dedication or an early warning sign about the local economy's long-term health. As the coal industry shifted and rail traffic declined through the mid-20th century, Thurmond lost its population steadily until almost everyone was gone. The National Park Service, which manages the New River Gorge National Park surrounding the town, now administers much of Thurmond's historic commercial district. The C&O Railway Depot has been restored and serves as a visitor center, and Amtrak's Cardinal train still stops there 3 times per week in each direction, making Thurmond the smallest Amtrak station in the country by population, possibly in the world. Number 9. Centralia's neighbor in desolation, Pitcher cousin, Pitcher, Oklahoma, alternate, Doel, Indiana. Doel, Indiana, sometimes spelled Doel, is an unincorporated community in Fountain County that barely registers on maps and has no particular claim to fame beyond a specific kind of persistence. Small, unincorporated communities like Doel represent a category of American place that the 20th century largely passed over without making a deliberate decision to do so. The Crossroads store closed. The one-room school consolidated into a township school 2 towns over. The grain elevator moved to a larger facility. And Doel, like hundreds of communities across the Indiana interior, became a collection of farmhouses and a handful of residents who remain not out of stubbornness or poverty, but simply because they have farms there and the land is good, and nobody particularly asked their opinion about whether their community should survive. What Doel and places like it represent is the quieter side of American forgetting. Not disaster, not industrial collapse, not contamination, just the slow arithmetic of rural depopulation that has steadily reduced the population of small, unincorporated communities across the Midwest since the 1950s, as farm mechanization reduced the number of workers needed and consolidated purchasing moved economic activity to larger centers. Indiana alone has hundreds of communities in this category, places that appear on county maps, have historical society entries, and maintain small cemeteries that local families continue to maintain with care, even as the communities themselves have dwindled to a level that most urban Americans would consider effectively non-existent. Fountain County historian James Lowe has noted that communities like Doel represent the majority of Indiana's actual geography and history, the part nobody writes about because nothing dramatic happened there, which is itself a kind of quiet argument for paying attention. Number 8. Anvik, Alaska. Anvik is a small Athabascan community on the Yukon River in western Alaska, with a population that has fluctuated around 70 to 100 people for decades. It is not a ghost town. The Episcopal Mission Church built there in 1895, Christ Church, still holds services, making it one of the oldest continuously active church buildings in Alaska. The community has a school, a post office, and the kind of subsistence lifestyle economy built around fishing, hunting, and gathering that has sustained Athabascan people in the Yukon River region for thousands of years. What makes Anvik forgotten in the context of American history is partly geographical, accessible only by small aircraft or riverboat in summer and snowmobile in winter, and partly because the history that happened there never got the national attention it deserved. Anvik was a significant trading post and mission station during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, documenting contact between Euro-American missionary culture and the Athabascan people of the Yukon drainage in records that are now held in archives and represent some of the more comprehensive early documentation of that cultural contact in interior Alaska. The mission records, which include diaries, correspondence, and population surveys going back to the 1880s, have been used by researchers studying the demographic and cultural impacts of the mission period on interior Alaskan communities. Anvik itself continues in its own present tense, largely unconcerned with its historical significance to outside researchers, occupied with the Yukon River and the seasonal rhythms that have defined life in that valley long before anyone thought to write any of it down. Number 7. Fayette Historic Town Site, Michigan. Fayette is a ghost town on the Garden Peninsula of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, sitting on the shore of Snailshell Harbor on Lake Michigan, and it is one of the better preserved examples of a 19th century industrial company town anywhere in the Great Lakes region. The Jackson Iron Company built the town starting in 1867 to smelt pig iron using local hardwood charcoal and iron ore shipped in from mines on the Upper Peninsula, and the town site includes a surviving blast furnace complex, a hotel, a company store, machine shops, and workers' housing, all of which stand in various states of preservation along the harbor's edge. The company operated until 1891, when the combination of depleted local hardwood supplies and improved rail access to cheaper pig iron from elsewhere in the country made the Fayette operation uneconomical. The town was sold and changed hands several times, was used briefly as a resort, and eventually came into the possession of the state of Michigan, which now manages it as Fayette Historic State Park. The park does an unusual amount of actual interpretation, given how few people visit. Living history programs, guided tours, and exhibits on both the iron industry and the working class community that lived and worked in Fayette during its 24 operational years. The harbor is beautiful. The bluff above the town site offers views across Lake Michigan, and on a weekday in any season other than peak summer, you can walk the entire historic town site with almost nobody else around. Travel writer Jerry Dennis, who has written extensively about the Great Lakes, described Fayette as the kind of place that makes you feel like you've found something that wasn't meant to be found, which is an accurate description of how the site tends to register with the people who happen across it. Number 6. Haena, Hawaii, before the road. Haena is a small community at the end of the road on the north shore of Kauai, and for most practical purposes, it has always existed slightly apart from the rest of Hawaii's tourist infrastructure, simply because getting there required commitment even before a major 2018 flood damaged the only access road and prompted a significant restriction on vehicle access that changed the character of the area entirely. The flooding in April 2018 caused by a record rainfall event, the wettest day ever recorded in the United States, with 49.69 inches of rain falling in 24 hours at a gauge on the mountain above Haena, washed out sections of Kuhio Highway, the only road to the area, and closed Napali Coast State Wilderness Park and the surrounding trailheads for over a year. When access was restored, the state implemented a mandatory reservation and shuttle system that dramatically reduced the number of vehicles reaching the end of the road, transforming what had been an accessible, if remote, destination into something that required advanced planning. The Limahuli Garden and Preserve, operated by the National Tropical Botanical Garden in the valley above Haena, has conducted significant archaeological and botanical preservation work in the area, documenting taro cultivation terraces and traditional Hawaiian land management systems going back centuries. The cultural history of Haena, rooted in traditional Hawaiian land division and stewardship of one of the most biologically diverse valleys in the Hawaiian Islands, is documented there in a way that the casual visitor who shows up primarily for Napali Coast photographs rarely has time to engage with. Haena was always more than the view from the trailhead. Most people never stopped long enough to find that out. Number 5. Bannack, Montana. Bannack was the first territorial capital of Montana, established in 1862 following a gold discovery in Grasshopper Creek, and it has the distinction of having produced one of the more dramatic episodes of frontier vigilante justice in American history. Henry Plummer, the town's sheriff, was secretly leading a gang of road agents called the Innocents, who were robbing and murdering miners and travelers throughout the region. When the community finally figured out what was happening, a group of vigilantes formed in 1863, rounded up Plummer and his associates, and hanged Plummer on his own gallows in January 1864. The town eventually declined as the gold ran out and more productive strikes were made elsewhere in Montana, and the population drifted away steadily through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The last permanent residents left in the 1970s. Montana acquired the site in 1954 and has managed it as Bannack State Park since then, with a policy of arrested decay, similar to the approach California uses at Bodie. Buildings are stabilized but not restored, left to age at their natural pace without renovation that would compromise their authenticity. Over 60 structures survive at Bannack, including the hotel, the Masonic Lodge, a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church, the jail, and the gallows where Plummer was hanged. The site hosts Bannack Days, an annual event held in July featuring living history demonstrations that draws a few thousand visitors. For the other 50 weeks of the year, the town sits in its valley mostly alone, which is either peaceful or melancholy, depending on the weather and your mood. Number 4. Elgin, Texas. Elgin, Texas is not forgotten in the sense of being abandoned. It has around 9,000 people, a functioning economy, and a position on U.S. Highway 290 between Austin and Houston that gives it consistent traffic. What is forgotten about Elgin is its historical significance as the origin point of a specific sausage that became one of the most regionally specific foods in American barbecue culture: Elgin hot gut sausage. The sausage was developed by German and Czech immigrant butchers working in the region around Elgin in the late 19th century, using the beef and pork offcuts, specifically including the small intestine casing that gave the sausage its colloquial name. Southside Market, established in Elgin in 1882, is still operating and still producing the original recipe sausage that has made the town a barbecue pilgrimage destination for enthusiasts of Texas-style smoked meat. What has been genuinely forgotten is the broader cultural history of Central Texas barbecue's German and Czech immigrant origins, which produced the style of meat market barbecue: smoked brisket, ribs, and sausage sold by weight and eaten on butcher paper, that Texas has exported globally as its own distinct culinary identity. Elgin is where a significant piece of that history physically started and physically continues, in the form of a 140-year-old meat market that sells sausage from the same location using methods that have evolved but not fundamentally changed since the late 1800s. Most people driving through on 29 stop for gas and keep going. The ones who stop at Southside Market are considerably better fed for the rest of the drive. Number 3. Point Arena, California. Point Arena is a small coastal town in Mendocino County, California, with a population of around 450 people, sitting on a dramatically exposed headland where Highway 1 runs close enough to the ocean that winter storms occasionally spray the road. It has a lighthouse, the Point Arena Lighthouse, rebuilt in 1908 following earthquake damage from 1906, and the tallest lighthouse on the west coast of the United States at 115 feet that can be toured and whose keepers' quarters are available as vacation rentals. The town itself is a collection of Victorian buildings and small businesses organized around a main street that has not changed its fundamental character in roughly a century. There's a movie theater, the Arena Theater, a single-screen house built in 1928 that continues to operate as a first-run and repertory cinema, one of the last independently operated single-screen theaters in the California coastal region, and a small harbor that supports a modest commercial fishing fleet. What makes Point Arena specifically forgotten, rather than merely small, is that it sits between Mendocino to the north and Sea Ranch to the south, both of which draw significant tourist attention, and Point Arena tends to be a place people pass through rather than stop in. Writer and environmentalist Barry Lopez, who spent time along the Northern California coast, described the Mendocino County coastline in general as a place that seems to exist at a remove from everything the rest of the country is rushing toward. And Point Arena sits at the quietest end of that remove, which is either its appeal or its problem, depending on what you're looking for when you travel. Number 2. Shacktown, remnants of Okemah, Oklahoma's Woody Guthrie legacy sites. Okemah is a small town in Okfuskee County in eastern Oklahoma, population around 3,000, and it was the birthplace of Woody Guthrie in 1912. Guthrie grew up there during a period of significant boom and bust driven by oil discovery and agricultural cycles and the experiences of poverty, displacement, and Dust Bowl migration that he observed in and around Okemah became the raw material for decades of American folk music that shaped the country's understanding of its own economic history in ways that have never been fully credited. The town has a complicated relationship with its most famous native son. For decades, Okemah did not acknowledge Guthrie publicly. The politics of his music, which leaned strongly leftward and were explicitly pro-labor and anti-corporate, made him an uncomfortable figure for a conservative Oklahoma town during the Cold War era and after. A Woody Guthrie Folk Festival was established in the town in 1998 and has run annually since, helping shift the local attitude toward something more like recognition. What remains forgotten is not Guthrie himself, but the physical landscape of the Okemah he grew up in, the neighborhoods and surrounding countryside that formed his specific understanding of the American experience. The house where he was born burned down years before any preservation effort could be organized. The visual record of the Okemah of his childhood is sparse. What you find in Okemah today is a small, economically stressed Oklahoma town with a music festival named for its most famous resident and a mural downtown, a place doing its best to hold on to a connection to history while dealing with the same pressures that have hollowed out hundreds of similar communities across the region. Number 1. Matinicus Island, Maine. Matinicus Island sits roughly 23 miles off the coast of Rockland, Maine, making it the most remote year-round inhabited island on the Maine coast. It has somewhere between 40 and 70 permanent residents depending on the season and the year, a one-room schoolhouse that operates when there are enough children to justify it, a small airstrip, and a ferry connection to the mainland that runs approximately once a month in winter and more frequently in summer, though more frequently in this context means a few times a month rather than anything approaching daily service. The island has been continuously inhabited since the 1750s, surviving British raids during the Revolutionary War, a documented tradition of fierce independence from mainland authority that has led to multiple confrontations with state fish and game authorities over lobstering territory, and most recently, a 2010 dispute over lobster fishing grounds that escalated to gunfire between two lobstermen on the water, resulting in felony charges and a trial that drew national attention to an island most of the country had never heard of. The lobstering economy is everything on Matinicus. The island's permanent residents are almost entirely lobstermen and their families, along with the handful of support businesses and the occasional artist or writer who comes for the isolation and usually discovers fairly quickly whether they actually meant it when they said they wanted to get away from everything. Travel writer Bill Bryson, who documented the New England coast in various essays over the years, described Maine's island communities as places where the definition of community gets tested against actual conditions rather than the idea of them, which is a polite way of saying that 23 miles of cold Atlantic Ocean has a way of clarifying exactly what you value about other people. America keeps forgetting things it probably should have kept track of. Every one of these places is still there, still worth the trip, still carrying more history than most famous landmarks 3 times their size. If you enjoyed this one, hit like and subscribe. There are a lot more forgotten corners out there.